Hello everyone, welcome to SMITE God Discussions with your host Professor Reha. Now, since the next god that I've decided that I'm going to go through a series with is Athena. There are a couple of reasons for this. Right now, she is one of the really popular guardians at this time. There are a couple of reasons for that I'm going to get into in a bit, but I'm actually going to start her series off the way I should have started Kepri's off, by first talking about her in general. I released Kepri's yesterday, so you have that. After, of course, all his videos were released. This time I'm doing it in the proper order. So, Athena as a support god is quite interesting because she does a large amount of damage despite the fact that she's a support. So, the primary example of this, and whether or not this is a good or a bad thing depends upon what you think the role of a support should be, but we have Reach. Essentially, after using an ability, your next auto is ranged and does extra damage. So, yay for that. But the problem I have with this, at least from a support point of view, is that while yes, you can finish off an enemy that's about to escape, or you can do extra damage to set up for kills, you can also either accidentally or intentionally steal kills with this quite easily. And also, the point of a support is not necessarily to do damage a lot of the time. I mean, yes, they can, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for your support to slap like a legend. That's fine. That's not necessarily a problem. But the main role of a support is to keep the rest of the team alive. That is the primary role here. Absorb the damage, keep the team alive, make sure the enemy is unable to properly retaliate. Now, to be fair, Athena has a lot of interesting tools to help with this. Reach itself, of course, does nothing for supporting, but you have Preemptive Strike, which obviously hits pretty hard, but it does two very interesting things for Athena. First off, it slows the enemy god. That's fine. Slows are pretty common, slows are nice. What is particularly interesting about Preemptive Strike's slow, though, and this is something I have never yet been able to adequately explain, is that a lot of enemies will take the slow and just leave it. They might use their escape ability if they have one, but I've almost never seen anyone beads out of Preemptive Strike, even if it would have saved their life. I don't know why. A large number of players eat a Preemptive Strike, either expecting it to not hit as hard as it does, which it really does hit pretty hard, and they really just generally ignore the slow that it inflicts in over 9 out of 10 times. This is like, I would say I've encountered maybe 2% of my enemies have cleansed the slow in moments of dire need. The rest of them have just died, even when a beads would have saved their life there, or at least given them a much better chance at survival. It's very odd. But that's just one thing with Preemptive Strike. Otherwise, it's a standard slow, other than its really bizarre psychological effect on the enemy. And I don't know if anybody else has this experience either. If you've had this experience with Preemptive Strike, please shout out in the comments below. I want to know if it's just me that has this, or if this is just something common to Athena in general. The second thing, and more significant, is that Preemptive Strike gives Athena a block stack when she hits an enemy, which means that the next auto attack means nothing. Now, sometimes this doesn't matter if you're facing off against an enemy guardian. That's not really going to matter at all. But against hunters, this can be quite significant, and there's actually certain gods where this can really give Athena a huge advantage. Namely, such gods as Hunbots. Maybe you're blocking his passive boosted auto attack. Kabraken's stun auto attack. Maybe you're blocking that. Maybe you're blocking that one crit that'll kill you. There's all kinds of very unusual one-shot autos. Maybe you're blocking Tsukiyomi's ranged auto. There's a surprisingly large number of circumstances in which even a single block stack can actually spare you a lot of damage. So don't underestimate the individual block stack. It's substantially more useful than a lot of people would believe it is. It's quite a surprisingly useful block. Now, this is the first indication, by the way, that Athena really heavily needs to emphasize cooldown. Now, with Khepri, cooldown is good, but it's not 100% necessary. You can get away without necessarily building a lot of cooldown on Khepri. Khepri really wants HP over all of the things. Athena's different. Athena isn't quite as concerned about her HP. If you get some HP on an item, that's nice, but it's not something you're actively searching for. With Athena, you really want cooldown. You want max cooldown as quickly as possible. And this is one of the reasons why. You want to be slapping as many enemies with preemptive strike as possible, because you really want to rack up as many block stacks as possible. And in team fights, people are going to try to ignore you, which is fine. Preemptive strike away. Grab more block stacks, so that way when they have to pay attention to you, you have the block stacks. Now, this also combos extremely well with Taunt. I'm sorry, Confound. This is typically called Taunt because it's basically all it did for the longest time was just Taunt. Now it does damage, and it does respectable damage too. I mean, it's not huge, but it's decent enough to actually be noticeably harmful to a lot of enemies. But the Taunt, if you don't know what a Taunt does, the Taunt forces the enemy that is taunted to slowly run at the taunter and use only auto attacks. It is basically a softer version of Khepri's Abduct, which is also kind of why I wanted to go into Athena, because it is a really interesting correlation. If you actually started off supporting with Khepri as well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I only started with Khepri because of nostalgia, but the two abilities, Confound and Abduct, they function mechanically differently, but the spirit of the abilities is the same. You are pulling an enemy towards your team, and they can only auto-attack. That's basically the goal here. Now, since they're auto-attacking, your block stack from Preemptive Strike is going to really at least help prevent this from being as dangerous as Khepri's Abduct will. Khepri has the bonus HP, which oftentimes is all he needs. Confound has the block stack. So again, you have some parallels here. But more to the point, Confound is the reason you don't build Gem of Isolation on Athena, unless you're a solo lane or you really want the enemy to basically be standing still when you taunt them. Now, the reason why is very simple. Now that Confound does damage, it will trigger Gem of Isolation, and that taunted enemy will practically not be moving. Now, this has its pros and cons. Obviously, it's a little easier for your allies to... It's very, very slightly easier for your allies to hit a practically rooted enemy. But on the other hand, it is much more difficult to get that enemy to run into an even more dangerous situation. It's a little bit less distance they're running towards you. It'll be harder to pull them under a Phoenix or Tower. It'll be harder to pull them into an ally's AoE, things of that nature. Beforehand, it wasn't necessarily an entirely bad idea to build Gem of Isolation on Athena, but now that Confound does damage, as amazing as this is for her damage output, and as useful as this is for her, it now really makes Gem of Isolation more of a handicap for her general supporting strategy than anything else. So there are going to be situations in which Gem of Isolation might be the move, but be very careful with it, because this will make Confound quite a bit difficult to use as a method of maneuvering an enemy where you want them. So do keep that in mind if you're thinking about Gem of Isolation, keep this in mind. The third ability is also something I have some support issues with, but it's a very amazing ability. Shield Wall. First stage of the ability, soldiers fall. Damage. Couple seconds, 2 specifically, they slap people for extra damage. Lots of damage. Now, this is not fantastic for supporting. Gem of Isolation actually really helps this, in stark contrast to Confound, and this was the ability that really justified the use of Gem of Isolation decently consistently on a lot of Athena mains for a very long time, because that first hit is going to slow the enemy, then you taunt them without doing any damage. Their slow wears off just as the taunt is about halfway through, so they still speed a little bit. They wander deeper into the shield wall. The second stage of shield wall hits for the extra damage, then they're slowed again. If you timed it exactly perfectly, you would shield wall wait 1 second, taunt. Their slow wears off. They're in the shield wall. Bam, more damage, re-slowed. Preemptive strike, because by the time preemptive strike is done charging, because preemptive strike takes, I think, about a second to charge. Charge up preemptive strike after the second stage of shield wall, you would shield wall them. That's a double slow on that, because it's already natural slow and the Gem of Isolation. And then you have just successfully inflicted 4 slows on the enemy in your regular kit with Athena. This was potent. This was quite effective. But you can no longer do this because now Confound also slows. Whether you consider that a benefit or a negative really depends on how you utilize Confound. I personally really use Confound a whole lot to maneuver the enemy, to move the enemy closer to some specific position. I use it a lot in the laning phase to readjust where the enemy is. You'll see that in future videos where I really am, a full half of the reason I use Confound is just to move the enemy somewhere where I want them to be. This is how I play her, because I'm a really old school player. I was playing her, I got her to Diamond back when Confound did no damage, and the only point of Confound was the taunt, and that's all we did with it. So my view of Confound is admittedly old-fashioned. If you're a newer player and you really like how Gem of Isolation interacts with Confound, go for it. If you're an old player who just really believes in the power of Gem of Isolation even with the damage on Confound, that's totally fine. Gem of Isolation doesn't make Confound less effective. It changes how it functions, basically. It goes from a taunt to basically a root with auto attacks involved, essentially. I mean, it's not a literal root because they still do move very slightly, but it's such a small amount that they move, it's absolutely ridiculous. So, yeah. That was fairly potent. And then you have, of course, the famous Defender of Olympus. Now, there is always going to be times, I don't care who you are or how long you've played Athena, there's going to be those moments where you're going to try to use this on an ally and they're going to die. Because it takes almost 4 seconds for this to actually trigger. That's fine. They're getting 30% damage mitigation while they have the aura on them, and you're basically just there to try to save their life. This is an incredibly potent ability, and this one ultimate right here is the reason why people try to jungle with Athena. And I want to talk about this fairly heavily, because this is a moderately contentious subject, depending on, again, your view of Guardians. Now, Athena's not fast. She does not run fast. This, normally, puts her at an extreme disadvantage in the jungle. Yes, her jungle camp clear is stupid awesome with the famed shield wall. This is extremely potent in the jungle, especially with today's jungling starter items. Absolutely slapping. Great. But you run slow, so the enemy jungler is going to out-rotate you and out-farm you in pretty short order, except you have a global ult in Defender of Olympus. Now, when you're jungling with Athena, it is your use of Defender of Olympus that will 100% define whether you succeed or fail as a jungling Athena. And there are going to be some players that will disagree with this statement. But these are people who are either hyper good jungles, or they are against a enemy jungler who is very nearly or equally as slow as Athena. In terms of movement speed, Athena will be slower than pretty much everyone else except for jungling enemy guardians, which still will obviously happen. Even warriors are slightly faster. It's just not as cripplingly, well, I won't say cripplingly, it's just not as significant a disadvantage that Athena faces in that scenario. But most junglers are assassins who move fast. Not by that much, but by enough to be noticeable. So, if you're going to jungle with Athena, make sure you use Defender of Olympus really smart, really wisely. If you're in the left jungle, don't use Defender of Olympus on left lane. I don't care if they're in trouble. I don't care if it might be their only method of surviving. It's not worth throwing your ult away for that. Instead, use it in right lane, go all the way over there, in a really surprise gank that nobody will see coming, and either push back or outright kill the right lane. Again, similar principle for right jungle. Oh, I'm in right jungle, solo lane looks like it might have a good opportunity for a gank. Let me just ult on over there. This is an oversimplified version, obviously, and there will be moments where you'll see an ally in trouble in a nearby lane, and you will ult them because that is the right thing to do. I'm grossly exaggerating. The previous scenario was grossly exaggerated for emphasis, but that's basically what you have to use. You have to use Defender of Olympus half of the time specifically just to get somewhere faster, because that is your major move advantage over the enemy jungler. The only exception to this is Mercury, who basically isn't going to care. Mercury's always a problem, though, at least in terms of his speed, his ability to farm, and his ability to gank ahead of you. That's going to be a problem regardless of who you are, so Athena's not alone in that. But that is where you have to go with this. Personally, again, I'm old school. I don't particularly, personally, like Athena in the jungle, but there's some merit to the idea. I would recommend you not try this unless A, you are excruciatingly familiar with Athena, or B, you are an excruciatingly good jungler. Then I'll say, yeah, go for it, learn it, take some time, practice it, get used to it. It is effective. She can be an incredibly effective jungler, but it takes practice, it takes very thorough knowledge, and you have to have the right mindset. I just don't play her that way. I'm just not comfortable playing her that way. Unless there is an absolutely massive demand for it, I am not going to be showing you a jungle Athena because I'm not particularly fond of it, personally. It's just a personal preference. But I will always defend the idea of jungle Athena. It just comes down to the skill of the player, and the knowledge of the player, just as important. Practice makes perfect. Don't be afraid to practice it. I know the SMITE community can get toxic sometime, but mute them, report them, ignore them. You gotta start somewhere. With that being said, let's talk about some of the things that I build on Athena. Now, again, Sentinel's Gift, pretty much this should be in every Guardian's starter kit. At least as an option. I really also like War Flag quite a lot on Athena, especially with the Spartan Flag in the end game, because that is surprisingly very potent with Athena. You get a little bit of magic power, you get some decent health, you get MP5, which is nice in Conquest, but more importantly, you give 10% increased power to everyone in this radius. Now, Spartan Flag I tend to build a little bit more in Arena and Clash, where the areas are much smaller and your allies are going to be standing in the circle for a more consistent amount of time. It's really nice also in Joust. I don't usually build this in Conquest. This is not something I normally build in Conquest. This is normally something I'll go for in Arena. It's great in Arena. I love this in Arena. I adore War Flag and Spartan Flag in Arena. It's a lot. It's a great time. It's a great time if you're not excessively aggressive. It can make a huge difference, actually, in Arena. So, absolutely take it there. Clash, again, is another great place for this. Tainted Steel, I only really use this if I'm really expecting there to be a really serious healing problem on the enemy team. It occasionally happens. The enemy team has Chung on the solo lane, Hell in the mid lane, and a support Aphrodite. Tainted Steel 100% all day, every day. I mean, obviously. That's about it. But for the Conquest, you're mostly going to be sticking with Sentinel's Gift. Now, if you were going to jungle with Athena, again, I don't have this in here because I'm not fond of this particular playstyle, but absolutely knock yourself out. You have a couple of options. First off, I would really recommend Boomba's Hammer. After casting an ability, your next basic attack deals an additional 80 true damage. That includes your spear, your thrown spear there. So that can be pretty substantial. Not only are you doing 50% extra damage off your basic attack there, but you're also doing an additional 80 true damage, and since you only are able to throw the spear after hitting an ability in the first place, it's a no-brainer. Boomba's Hammer is very strong on her, and the Boomba's Dagger's heal is also really going to help you sustain enough where you can stay out in the jungle maybe a little bit longer than the enemy jungler. Perhaps. It depends on who they are and what they build. Furthermore, Boomba's Hammer has the amazing ability of reducing your cooldowns by a second and healing you. Now, what gives Athena a huge advantage here in regards to this is the fact that most, if not all, of your competition is going to be melee, which means you can trigger your Boomba's hammer from a distance, and I don't care what your competition is, they are extremely unlikely to have that capacity. So, unless they're playing a jungling mage, or for some reason a jungling hunter, they're not really going to be able to compete with this. Tsukiyomi could, but I think that's about it off the top of my head. It's quite impressively potent. That usually is what I would recommend for that. You could also do Protector of the Jungle as well if you feel like you need those physical protections. It's something you're going to have to make a call on based on the enemy's composition, but I don't usually recommend this for that particular build because, frankly, Athena doesn't really need attack speed that much. Let's be really honest. She's mostly an ability-focused god, throwing a single individual auto attack between abilities. So attack speed isn't that important to her, so I usually wouldn't recommend using Protector of the Jungle. It really depends. Maybe you're building an auto attack Athena because you're insane. It theoretically could work, but I just don't really see that as being pretty popular. Something else that you may also want to consider as well would be animosity. You, of course, would have the 4% of your maximum health as magical damage. This I would actually recommend more if you were playing a solo Athena. Athena in the solo lane has just the usual sustain problems that are very common to Guardians in the solo lane. That's about it. If your enemy can out-sustain you and has the required protections, you're going to be in for a rough time. But if your enemy either lacks the protections or the sustain in solo lane, you have a really good shot at this. So, that's all fine. Also, with the advent of Confound having damage output, it will now also heal you, as well as taunting the enemy. So Vampiric Shroud and Blood-Soaked Shroud offer some unique options if you wanted the lifesteal and the physical protection. What starter items you will have in your slots up here really depends on where you want to play her. Unlike Khepri, who is only theoretically capable of playing any role and just really is terrible in all roles except support, Athena can do a really respectable job in the jungle and solo lanes. So what specific role you want to play her in will change what your starter items would be. These three are what I recommend if you're playing her in a support role. If you're playing her in the jungle role, you're going to be looking at Moomba's Dagger, Eye of the Jungle, or Vampiric Shroud. If you're playing her in the solo lane, you're going to be looking at Benevolence, Vampiric Shroud, or possibly Warrior's Axe. You're going to be looking at one of these three if you're in the solo lane, so it really depends on where you want to put her. Now, besides the starter items, which you are going to want to customize based on where you want to put Athena, the rest of these items are pretty much going to be the kinds of items you're typically going to be pulling on for the most part. I'm going to mention some exceptions here, but Sovereignty, I use this pretty much all the time on her because most team comps consist of 3 physical, 2 magic, so this is a very common build for me. I actually accidentally skipped over the shoes. I usually build Shoes of Focus in pretty much all circumstances. And if you're, the only exception to this would be if you're playing solo lane with her, maybe Shoes of the Magi would be a little better for that little bit of magical lifesteal, that extra magic power. And if you're jungling with her, please buy Traveler's Shoes. It's your big hope. That's going to at least keep you apace with the enemy jungler if they don't also buy Traveler's Shoes or Traveler's Boots or whatever. But if they don't build it, and a lot of assassins don't build that, let's be really honest, then you are going to actually be able to keep up with them, and ult usage becomes less of an emergency. You can have some leeway with your ult if you build Traveler's Shoes. Besides, it does 25 magic power isn't that bad. The 15 MP5 you will appreciate. Trust me. Athena is very mana intensive, even as a jungler. So that 15 MP5 can actually really come in handy for her. But if you are jungling with her, Traveler's Shoes is what you're going to be building almost every time. The only exception to this would be if you're facing off against an enemy jungling Guardian, then maybe Traveler's Shoes aren't strictly necessary. You probably will want to go into either Shoes of Focus or Shoes of the Magi there, depending on what you feel is appropriate for that situation. Depends on who your enemy jungler is. Silver Breastplate, I frequently build Breastplate of Valor here. Every once in a blue moon I'll build Spectral Armor, depending on how the enemy is building. Hide of the Nemean Lion works really well with the block stacks of Preemptive Strike, but I don't often actually build that unless the enemy team is so physical dominant and has so many auto attacks that it is just that important to have. I have built all of these items at least once for various reasons, and they've worked out pretty well. So this is actually, you'll frequently be pulling from here a lot, whether you're in solo or a support. And then, of course, Pridwin. Now, Pridwin with Athena is a fairly interesting scenario because you can practically guarantee that you will hit the enemy with this. But you can also practically guarantee that you will not be hitting them with 100% of this, because you can taunt them towards you, which forces them into the Pridwin, but they will be auto-attacking at the same time, which guarantees that the Pridwin will not be at 100% strength. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but generally speaking, if only for the slow, it is really nice. So that would be really what I would recommend there. And she can use the extra protections. The cooldown reduction, of course, as I stated earlier, Athena really wants cooldown, so Pridwin is really good for that as well. This is something you can use pretty much regardless of where you're putting her, because there is some damage there that you can take advantage of. No one says no to cooldown reduction, and you have some decent protections there. Now, for damage, again, this is mostly what you're going to be pulling regardless. Stone of Fall is actually unusually effective on her for a couple of reasons. First off, you can actually open with some damage mitigation right off the top, because you just have to hit him with a basic attack. It provides you with a little bit of both protections. It provides you with a little bit of power, a little bit of health, and you get to open most fights with a 2% damage mitigation. You taunt them, you give them another smack. Oh look, now I have 4%. I mean, think of it this way. I'm going out of order here, but consider. I have Stone of Fall. I charge up my preemptive strike, slam into the enemy, hit them with my spear. 2% damage mitigation. Slap down my soldiers, immediately throw my spear, 4% damage mitigation, taunt them into the soldiers, throw my last spear, 3 stacks, 12% mitigation, 12% mitigation, and for the next 10 seconds I am taking 12% less damage. If I've gone particularly bold and spicy, maybe even less, depending on how we're running here. So Stone of Fall, even if you're jungling, can actually be quite potent. Like I said, you've got a little bit of power there as well. The little bit of protections doesn't hurt. A lot of junglers are building some protections. Stone of Binding is pretty nice also. I don't usually build Stone of Binding because I'm a more passive support player. But Stone of Binding also works really well on her because, unlike with Khepri, she could really utilize that protection drop that she's inflicting on the enemy just as much as your ADC can, or even if you don't have an ADC. So Stone of Binding is also a very powerful item on her, and of course, Voidstone goes without saying is just a snack all around. Now, if you're building jungle, you are going to want to lean towards these. There is some justification in a solo or a support role where you might go for Soul Gem. It really depends on if you really feel like your team needs the healing, and if the enemy team isn't building anti-healing. Since all of your abilities deal damage, you can rack up the Soul Gem's AoE heal pretty quickly, and it gives you cooldown reduction, which is really nice. But don't underestimate the potential usefulness of Soul Gem, even on a supporting Athena. Again, I don't usually build this, but there are times where I have, and it's been very effective. Pythagram's Peace, again, similar kind of idea. Athena can use Pythagram's Peace just as much as allies can. I usually will build this when I have nothing else that I really need to build. I have all the protections I need for whatever reason. Maybe the enemy team is just not building that much pen, and I want to punish that with a Pythag's Peace. That's fine. If you're playing jungle, obviously you're looking more towards Bancroft's and Typhon's Fang, but this tree can be quite effective on Athena given the right circumstances. So again, don't be afraid of going into some of these, even as a support. Now this is also something else fairly interesting. Abshard is only really going to be used if you're jungling and you need that pen. Divine Ruin is something that Athena can get away with using very effectively, more effectively than Khepri, again, because all of her abilities do damage, unlike Khepri. Well, yeah, Khepri's ult doesn't do any damage, but otherwise it's fine. So Divine Ruin is really nice if you really need that extra anti-healing and you didn't buy Tainted Steel. This only really happens if you've built your Contagion or your Pestilence, because only 3 of the enemy had some form of lifesteal, and then suddenly the entire enemy team has lifesteal, the enemy support has built Pythagoras Peace, and now they're just all lifestealing into next week, and you need extra anti-heal, and then you build Divine Ruin because it's too late to build Tainted Steel. In the same vein, though, Spear of the Magus is highly effective. Spear of the Magus is effective, again, regardless of where you're putting Athena. The increased damage from all sources passive is useful to inflict on enemies, whether you're a support, a solo, or a jungler. It doesn't really make a difference. Spear of the Magus is not necessarily ever a bad idea on Athena. Just don't build it too early, because you do want to be tanky enough to actually, help your allies if you're playing this as a support. But Spear of the Magus is also a really great item on here. Typically, I'm building Divine Ruin or Spear of the Magus if I'm building anything out of this tree. So there is that. Polynomicon, this is a purely aggressive thing. I only have this in here because I had a spare slot, and Polynomicon sometimes just feels right. I have actually had a couple of games where I've had to solo as Athena, not by choice, but because somebody didn't show up or whatever. And Polynomicon obviously works with the passives. That's pretty powerful right there. That's a good time. And if you're building jungle, you're probably looking to get into Polynomicon, especially if you have Typhon's Fang. That's a really great combo there. Actually, a really great thing to do would be Bancroft's, Typhon's, Spear of the Magus, Polynomicon. That's a lot of lifesteal, and that is a substantial boost in your power through Typhon's Fang. It's just something that's worthy of thought. Gauntlet of Thebes, obviously. I don't often build some of these other items from here. I don't very often build Mail of Renewal because, unlike Khepri, who takes the hit and just has the extra health to do so, you have block stacks, so Mail of Renewal is actually a bit harder to stack on Athena than it would be on a lot of other Guardians. So as a result, I don't often build this, and frankly, I will occasionally build Stone of Gaia, but it's rare enough that I don't necessarily want this down here, although I actually probably should just pull this right here. But I don't usually build Stone of Gaia either. If the enemy team has a whole lot of movement, crowd control, yeah, I'll build Stone of Gaia. But otherwise, it's mostly Gauntlet of Thebes. And even then, when I really need some self-healing, I'll either go in for Pythagoras Peace, or I'll go in for Soul Gem is pretty popular there. Or maybe I'll go for Spear of the Magus, but I'm not usually going to go into Stone of Gaia necessarily, especially considering that I can get almost as much HP from Soul Gem. I mean, honestly, I'll just go ahead and keep this. I had this in Gauntlet of Thebes for a specific reason. That was the reason. But yeah, I mean, in any situation that you would potentially use Stone of Gaia, Soul Gem is more team-focused, so I'll go for Soul Gem in those situations instead often. Like, I have built Stone of Gaia before on her in extremely specific enemy team comps. Again, if they have a lot of movement and crowd control, they've got Khepri, they've got, I don't know, Poseidon, and they've got Hercules. Yeah, Stone of Gaia would be good, but that's very rare. Then we have this goes without saying really, Pestilence is primarily what I use this for if there's a heavy enemy magic comp, Heart Ward obviously. Bulwark of Hope is really good if, again, you have that really heavy enemy magic comp, and you need that extra bit of magic protection, but even then, this isn't where I go to for standard magic protections. I'll build Pestilence only if they're late on magic damage and I need anti-heal, because I want to focus a little bit more on the physical protections. Usually, in most of my games, I'm building Sovereignty, Pestilence, Breastplate of Valor. That's pretty standard. There are deviations based on enemy comp, but that's the usual. When I just need extra magic protections, Genji's Guard. For the cooldown primarily. There are times when I don't need this cooldown, and if you have Stone of Fall, there is the potential for Oni Hunter's Garb to work with Stone of Fall and be very powerful. Considering that this stacks 3%, 3 times, it's 9%. If you happen to have Stone of Fall and you're really aggressive with it, then you are additionally looking at a great big hairy 21% damage mitigation, which isn't that bad. It's actually pretty good numbers. And you get MP5 there, magic protection obviously. I don't usually build Shogun's Kusari on her because she can't use it, and there are better auras, better items that I can build with her. I'd rather be healing them with Soul Gem, I'd rather be marking them for increased damage. There's other things I would rather do than build Kusari. As for over here, Spirit Robe, again, works really well with Oni Hunter's Garb or with Stone of Fall. If you're in crowd control and you have those other two effects on, you get all the way up to 36% damage mitigation. That's over a third. That's obviously a really specific scenario, and you're almost never going to see it, but conceptually it can work. But more to the point, this is double protections. This is 40 to 60, depending on which one you build, of each protection, and cooldown. This is generally why I don't build Magi's Cloak or Hide of the Urchin. Hide of the Urchin, although it provides that really nice bonus health shield, it doesn't provide Athena with the cooldowns she really needs. Health and mana are nice and all, so are protections, but what she wants is that cooldown. Magi's Cloak, honestly, with Athena, you can usually withstand a lot of crowd control because you probably have at least one block stack when you enter fight. You've got your taunt, so you, again, can pull people out of sustained CC abilities, like Tsukiyomi's Chain Swing, for instance, is a great example. Ardio's Root, with her energy beam there, I can't remember the name of. Things like that, you can taunt them out of it. So Magi's Cloak isn't necessarily as important. I have yet to build Magi's Cloak on Athena as far as I can remember. But this is generally what you want to be using on Athena, regardless of what role you're building. Now, if you are more fond of playing Athena aggressively, you may want to slap, potentially, Rod of Tahuti in here, Chronos Pendant. Actually, heck, we're going to go over here for a second. This pretty much whole tree is potentially useful for jungling Athena, or even in certain circumstances, a really nice brain cramp solo Athena. I mean, Rod of Tahuti not only affects your abilities, but it will also affect your thrown spear. Chronos' Pendant offers all that cooldown you really want. Here's some penetration, some movement speed for a faster Athena jungle. Same thing with here, except without the penetration and more power instead, so it's movement speed and power for, again, the jungling Athena in need. Now, one thing I will actually warn you, even if you're building the most aggressive Athena in the world, do not go to Rangda's Mask. If you want to do the Fighter's Mask start, go for it, knock yourself out. Do not finish to Rangda's. Now, you may be wondering, I mean, obviously, plus 15% damage taken can really slap. But I do more damage, Professor. Well, yes. But keep in mind that one of your damaging abilities forces an enemy to attack you. Plus 15% damage taken as a jungling Athena, with probably not as much protections as a solo or a support Athena, taunting the enemy ADC, without at least one block stack, is dead. You are a dead Athena. That's basically how that works. Don't build Rangda's Mask. Confound will kill you. But that would be all I would have to really say about Athena, her abilities, her build. I hope I've given you some food for thought, or at least some ways of refining your personal builds, or at least how you approach particular playstyles with Athena. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, any other cool item interactions I either didn't know or didn't mention here because I forgot about them or just didn't know, mention them in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Some other ways that people build and play Athena. This is how I build and play her. Again, just to recap, I almost exclusively play her support. I don't take her into the jungle if I can help it, and I don't take her into the solo lane if I can help it. There are pros and cons to taking her in both of those roles, but there are pros and cons of taking her into support too. You always have a trade-off. You just have to be very choosy about where you're trading off and what you're doing to compensate for it. But with that being said, thank you very much and have a great 24 hours.